Hey everybody, welcome to another Rackspace Office Hours live stream. My name is Alan Bush, and we are broadcasting live from the castle, our headquarters here at Rackspace in San Antonio, Texas. Joined as usual by Drew Cox, our co-host for the last 3 years now. Today is our
congratulations, happy anniversary.
Thank you. It's our third year doing this, which is I think pretty cool. Right? We've been able to do this for 3 years in a row and helped a lot of customers and shared a lot of information. So thanks to everybody that's helped us out with this, and we could not have done this without the help of a lot of people that got us started on this project, and then that were able to continue it. Especially Tyler, our producer, who's been with us for about 1.5 years and has been doing a lot of great things for us. So anyway, so. I just heard a little bit of applause at the studio audience that's out there, I guess. Great show that we're going to have today. It's something that I have no idea what it is. As far as I can tell, it's wizard magic. So here to take the contrary opinion on that is a frequent guest of the show, Martin Smith. Martin, how you doing today?
Good, glad to be here. I'm excited. I didn't know it was going to be an anniversary show. So
I didn't either until I was reminded. So. It's good.
Calendars sneak up on us here.
They do. It's our third anniversary, and I think it's your third time here.
I think so. That sounds about right.
Sounds about right. Well, you're always a great guest, and you've brought in another great guest. I'm assuming. No pressure, Jim. Jim Rosser, one of our other DevOps engineers. How you doing today, Jim?
Doing all right. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. Martin mentioned that you'd be a great addition to the Hangout, so we're happy to have you joining us for this one. So Jim and Martin, you're both DevOps engineers here at Rackspace. That's kind of a nebulous title, I think. So can you give us an idea of some of the things that you do here and how you help our customers?
Sure. So really, we're kind of we're working with a couple different services at Rackspace, everything from professional services and sort of doing automation for infrastructure, configuration management, all the way down to planning architectures, which is kind of like what we're going to talk about today. So we're kind of a jack of all trades for things automation and infrastructure. Like that term DevOps is often very nebulous.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. Jim, tell us a little bit about yourself. How long have you been a Racker?
I've been a Racker for almost a year. So yeah, I started out in the DevOps automation service group, and we're now the AWS automation group. So.
Great. Well, it's great to have you here, and really interested to see what you bring to this conversation, especially as a newer Racker, right? So it'll be interesting to get your take on this. All right. So as far as I can tell, Drew. The whole serverless idea is relatively new, right? I mean, we've needed to have a server at some point in time to host a website. I know that I've actually kind of moved to a serverless idea in that, the website for ohpodcast.com, the website for my personal blog, things like that, they're all served off of just static files, right? I don't have a website setting this up, but I mean, now we're looking at ways that you can actually execute code without a server.
Yeah, I think we've talked ad nauseum about the value of the CDN and being able to serve sites that are increasingly dynamic in a CDN and using that giant infrastructure that somebody else owns and someone else maintains and providing something as simple as possible for you to maintain while still meeting your goals, hitting those functions that you need to succeed, whatever your KPI or whatever that is for you, what you have to succeed, measure that. That can be still achieved through, a static site or any tool like that. And often, what we'll hear in the market is, that's all well and good, but that sounds like a lot of time to maintain. That's a lot of work to keep up with and stay on top of. That doesn't really map to what we're trying to do with our time and where we'd like to spend our resources. And so that's where I found the most value in this conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing from the two of you kind of what you're seeing in the serverless architectures world, where you're moving further and further away from the basic everyday administration of servers, because that's rarely value added towards a goal. And I'm excited to see more about how Lambda plays into this and how some of these other tools and features continue to obscure that, I guess, the day-to-day maintenance role.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as like the first time I saw something about serverless architectures was just even something simple like GitHub Pages. Probably some of our audience has heard about those before, where instead of setting up Apache and WordPress or whatever you need to do to have a website, it was literally just push some code somewhere and boom, you have a website. And not only that, but all you spent your time on was your content, which is so different than what we see like a lot today, which is infrastructure where you're spending a lot of time installing software, configuring it, worrying about things that ultimately like don't help your bottom line, and maybe aren't really like the meaty business part of what you're trying to do. So yeah, I think it's come a long way since then, looking at data centers and worrying about things like power to literally worrying about just the lines of code that power the important business logic of your site.
Absolutely. I know Rackspace got into the managed services game so that customers wouldn't have to worry so much about what exactly is the functionality of my backup from day to day. They could set a backup plan, and we would help manage and maintain that. Monitoring would be the same way, keeping things patched. I mean, we'll still hear there's a vulnerability in X, you need to go patch and update, and we jump in. We get involved and make sure that our customers' servers are taken care of, and that's part of the value that Rackspace brings. But the reason customers have come to us for so long is because that's not something that's valuable for them to hire someone to work on, when they could hire someone to work on a function that will get them closer to their goal. That's more of a maintenance role that can be outsourced. And so Rackspace gladly took the torch for that and would take that off the plate of our customers. This type of conversation goes a step further and says, there's less even to maintain, or we're taking that off the plate. So that conversation seems kind of an inevitable next step, and we've arrived at that step. So learning more about what that means, the implications, and how to approach it, I think is where I'm hoping to get a lot of insight.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, what do you think about this as far as helping our customers? I mean, do you have any ideas of how customers are starting to be able to streamline or kind of condense some of their server setups?
Yeah, so I mean, you think about it, especially in terms of cost. So when you do serverless architectures, you're generally not paying as much because you have containers or something on the back end that's actually distributed. There's a bunch of them clustered on a single instance. So that's really helpful. I really like the cost factor. And then as you guys have already mentioned, it's really helpful to not have to go in and worry about configuration management or things like that. You're just worrying about your software, what you're writing.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. All right, Martin. I think you had a pretty good idea of kind of how to walk us through the whole process. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to get my learn on. So I need to sit back and see what you have to say about this. So I'll let you go.
Okay, so at the risk of, I know you guys do a prediction show every year and a follow-up. At the risk of making a prediction, I think that maybe the serverless model might be the new cloud. Maybe I think we might start to, as a prediction. I know that it could be a ways out, and maybe we'll be saying that for a few years. But I see it as just like the next logical step in a lot of the concepts we already think about being cloud architectures, right? So. The utility model that we talk about with cloud is like a perfect example of something that now instead of a utility model for servers, we're talking about a utility model for literally line by line of code. Similarly, you have the concept of API-driven infrastructure, right? So like in the serverless world, you're writing just to the APIs. So I think like that's another place where you see that serverless model be the next evolution of cloud. And if you walk it back, I think you're talking, maybe 5 years ago we were talking about 3-tier architectures in data centers, and then virtualized, and then the cloud. And it's like the unit keeps getting smaller, right? Like we're focused on a data center, and then just on a server, and then on a virtual server, and then we're focused on now we're talking about literally being focused on a single function, a single module of code. So To me, that's just the next evolution. As Jim mentioned as well, there's a lot of interesting blog posts about it out there where you can kind of look at how it changes the cost model. And really with a CDN and some serverless architecture and maybe a database as a service like Drew mentioned, you really could write your whole website without ever touching a server. So that's sort of my elevator pitch for the serverless architecture and where it came from.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in obscuring that and getting that off of your plate as a content creator or as an app developer, not having to deal in the DBA world or not having to deal in the concept of I just need so much horsepower just to deliver all of this. Those are conversations that take away from the end function and typically put someone outside of their core competency as an individual. There are people who are DBAs, and oftentimes those people are basically working under an organization doing a database as a service offering, and so you get to take advantage of those DBAs' expertise through using the platform that they've created, and that gives you lots of benefits. It means you're not the one who's tinkering, and you may come to the end of your tinkering and have a great solution, but how much more time did it take you as a non-DBA to get to that end result when you could have used someone else's expertise that had already built something that was optimized, taken full advantage of it, and moved on towards that end goal, which is typically where we talk about prioritization on the show every single week. If you've gone through and said, my priorities are not to have a fully wholly owned set of infrastructure because of X, Y, or Z reason, then that shouldn't be one of the things you're spending a lot of time and energy on. You should conserve as much of that time and energy as possible and apply it towards those things that are high on the priority list. If it's your reach or your feature velocity or being able to actually get 2.0 out the door a little bit earlier, or whatever the case may be, that needs to come first, and you're wasting resources by dumping them into all of these other things. It used to be a necessity, and less is that the case for customers, that it's a necessity to spend cycles working on all these separate functions. So to be able to build something that doesn't require logging into a server or maintaining a device is a hugely beneficial thing when you can do that, and it allows you to be a little bit more flexible in where and when you're working from, which is a quality of life thing.
Yeah, and I would say too, like a lot of you mentioned a lot of things that could be positives, and they're definitely constraints still, right? So there's
Certainly
things like we've talked about. I think you've talked about on the show many times, like 12-factor stateless applications, some of these things that are design constraints, but actually I think there's a benefit and a drawback there, in that if you can constrain yourself in that way, then you can scale your architecture really far. And so that's like, while you get less functionality maybe out of the gate, then if you're doing something like AWS Lambda, you can actually then scale up pretty quickly, way more than you could if you were booting servers. So that's something that Amazon and other providers that do serverless architectures are thinking about scaling for you. So with a little bit of constraint, I think you get a lot of benefit. I'd be curious, Jim, what you think about some of those trade-offs and constraints too, because I think you have an interesting perspective on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you pointed out already that serverless architectures are not for everyone, and they're not even for every project. So there are probably some projects where you're going to need servers if you're having to deal with high performance, deal with like really finite latency. In those cases, serverless architectures may not be your bag, just because you're dealing with the distributed networking and things like that. So in those cases, you may need bare metal, but yeah, I think that if you have especially if you have a startup or something like that, and you're just kind of like starting out, you want to write your application, I think it's a great idea to go and look at serverless architectures. Go look at AWS Lambda, or there's a Google function or something like that they're coming out with, and things like that. And then just then at that point, you kind of look at your code in terms of yeah, like these small little modular functions that kind of all run as like an event machine. So it's definitely, it takes some, it's a difference in terms of thought, but and like I said, it's not for everyone, but yeah.
Well, we've talked about in the past, and this is a conversation I actually just had today with a customer. We sometimes have a hard time admitting that sports car is not going to do well off road. In the tech world, it's like, oh, there's this new great thing, we've got to use it, we've got to plug it in this place and in that place, and it's not always going to work well. If you want to go off road, I recommend a 4x4, something that's got more clearance and all those other features. It's going to do a good job there. You're never going to beat it in a street race against a sports car, but you shouldn't be taking your sports car off road. That's a bad idea. That's not what it was built to do. And so thinking through what you're actually doing and where you're going to get value, and not just using the shoehorn and saying this new hotness deserves to be everywhere. That's a bad idea. That's a bad approach. Often you're trying to take a sports car off road in that analogy, and you might go a little ways, but they're built lower to the ground for a reason, and you're not going to have the same experience that you'd have if you took the purpose-built vehicle and did the purpose-built action with that vehicle. And it's the same concept here. And so let's talk through a few more of those constraints around what is it really meant for, and what have you maybe talk through some of the times when you've stubbed your toe trying to shoehorn the tool in where it might not fit as well as maybe it seemed like it would fit well at first.
So I think the best place that I think you could use them immediately is when you have things like celery workers or areas like that. I think that's where AWS Lambda is, especially if you're first starting out. That's where it's going to shine the most, because basically you have SQS queuing and you have SNS topics that you can send these messages to, and then you just have workers go and pick them up. So I think that is, if you're starting out and you're thinking, I'm going to deploy this and I'm going to have a celery worker, start with AWS Lambda. It's going to be cheaper. You're not running a server, and it's going to fit perfectly into that.
I think.
Oh, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say also, like when you think about that, there's like all the classic examples too. So any kind of batch process, transcoding, sending email, things where you can farm out and you can restart if they break. Thinking about that analogy for the sports car too is you don't have to do it even if it's an existing project. You can move one piece into Lambda too. So it's not like you talk about the new hotness and everything is a racetrack and a sports car. Well, this is the kind of thing where you can go put some mud tires on your sports car and maybe try it a little bit. You don't have to move your whole architecture into it, which is something I think we see more and more with like microservices. If you have a microservices architecture already and you can just swap out one piece with Lambda, like that's another perfect place.
Well, I think there's the way I would take that analogy is you can use a rock crawler and a sports car as your daily driver if you want. I mean, it's probably not ideally set for that, but it'll work. So there are functions that you can certainly adopt that may not be total like wheelhouse, but work just fine. It'll be a great place to get some experience behind the wheel of that product before you necessarily put it full tilt into a purpose-built ideal spot.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to think about that this is one of those like transformative technologies like cloud where it's not just the work being done, like the example of a worker process. Everything about it changes. Everything from the life cycle. You talk about making sure you have testing and test systems. Like this is one of those cases where sometimes it's difficult to test this locally. So you really have to start thinking about testing. It's that thing we saw with containers and other technologies where they're so different. You really need identical test infrastructure. This is one of those. And then monitoring as well. Like there's a lot of things that when you scratch the surface of serverless architectures that suddenly come up. So it's definitely something you want to think about holistically. A new project, I think all of us have said some version of that already today, is a new project is probably better suited than trying to shoehorn something into it.
And that's a good point. I mean, I think that a lot of people unfortunately see the new hotness. That's the other thing we've said quite a bit. But I think some people see that and they say, hey, I'm going to go and try this on whatever I have access to. When really it's a great idea just in general, trying out anything new. I really recommend those greenfield applications, right, that are brand new, or if you're looking at something that is maybe you're looking at version 2.0 or something. So that's a way that we can that's a way that you can try out some of these newer technologies, see how it can help you, and then move on from there. Good point.
Yeah, and that's the one of the big revolutions in all of these technologies. Testing it is very simple. I mean, it's not going to cost you a ton of money, and it shouldn't cost you a ton of time to get a very quick, okay, I think I have a decent idea of how this might work. Now, once you get to implementation and you get further in, it's certainly going to be more work, but we had a conversation last week about, or 2 weeks ago, about our new on-metal product. You get a lot of horsepower that you can spin up for a couple of hours and do some benchmarking against, and you don't have to spend a ton of money. And traditionally, if you wanted that kind of horsepower, you're going to be on the hook for some sort of a contract with bare metal. But you can have an on-metal server spun up with the API for a short period of time and get some testing done. With serverless architectures, you can do some pretty simple testing without a giant outlay of cash and resources. Moving forward from there, you're going to need to do more to get a better idea of what it's fully functioning going to look like and how it's going to work for you. But in this day and age, testing is really not a... It's how far in the weeds you find yourself that's going to define how much you really spend, and it's going to be a time constraint more than it's going to be a cost constraint for the testing phase. So get out there and kick tires. Anytime there's a new exciting tool that you're wanting to try, just go try it. That's really a low barrier to entry in this day and age to most of these technologies. So it costs you a bunch of money, it might cost you some time, and you're definitely going to have to think through things differently. And let's take that thinking through things differently piece of the puzzle and talk through maybe some of the missteps and some of the light bulbs that came on around monitoring. Seems like a beautiful conversation to have, because I have no idea how you would go about monitoring a Lambda function. That doesn't seem easily some direction that you guys could share in that field, but let's talk about that a little bit more broadly. What are some of the things that you stumbled across that aren't as I guess intuitive in a serverless architecture?
So for the monitoring piece, at least, it's actually it makes it a little easier, at least with like AWS Lambda, where it can connect directly into CloudWatch. And so you can monitor and alert on things like what's your error rate. You can monitor. My invocations are, I expect like maybe 50 invocations of a Lambda function an hour, and I'm getting 5,000. We have a funny story about that. So you can monitor things like that. You can also, you have those logs going into your CloudWatch logs, and so you can trigger off those things as well. So if you start seeing Python errors or Node.js errors, something like that come through, you can actually trigger on those and deal with it that way. So monitoring actually is also almost just as easy. There's no worrying about installing a client somewhere, no third-party service trying to ping something. It's pretty straightforward as far as monitoring Lambda functions.
And that just goes back to say too, like you have to have logging, right? This is not one of those things where you spin up a server and then you just ignore the logs. Like without logs in something that's as a service, you have nothing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're blind to a lot.
Well, I think it's a common issue that people have is they try to, they say, hey, this thing just works, I don't need to monitor it. But if it stops working for whatever reason, you really want to know what happened right before it stopped working. So yeah, monitoring is always a great idea, and it seems like this is especially it makes it easy to monitor it, but you need to have the monitoring in place, right?
And it also, I think, you think about what kind of websites people are building today, and I think some of the same themes come up. That it's another place where the serverless architectures really dovetail well into popular frameworks and things that are already happening. If you're making, a lot of sites now only have a mobile app and they don't have a web presence, and so they have something like Lambda on the back end, And how are they monitoring it? Even if they have a server, all they have is an app and an API. So it's that same problem where they're having to monitor their app. It's like much more focused, like something like New Relic that's much more focused on the user experience and logging, and if metrics doubling or going half of what they were, that matters. So things like mobile apps fit really well into this serverless world.
Well, very cool. What are some of the other, I guess, shifts that have to be done in your thinking when you're approaching a serverless architecture as opposed to something maybe more traditional, or I guess this is still in that progression of containerized architectures as well. So as you're making that progression from bare metal all the way through, what are some of the big mental shifts that people need to make when adopting serverless?
So a lot of things are going to change in your code, and actually a lot of things are going to change in your local development as well. So as before, you'd write this kind of like, I wouldn't even say monolithic app, but you have this app that maybe it's an API server or something like that, and so it has all these different routes and all these different functions, and everything kind of ties back together. Whereas with like AWS Lambda, you're actually going to split all these things out into their own Lambda functions. It makes testing and like local development very interesting and tricky, and so I think the best thing I've actually seen so far is a lot of people will actually develop their app so that it can work as Lambda functions, all separate, talking between each other on a queue or SNS, and they can also run it locally with just like a bottle or a Flask or something like that, so they can run it that way. So that's a big challenge when you're first starting out. Is you really have to think about how you're structuring your code and how your code ultimately is going to be talking to each other. Because I mean, at the point where it's in AWS Lambda, you're not going to have a function that's doing all of these different things. You're probably going to want to fan it out into multiple functions and then return something back. So it's definitely a different way of thinking, and you're also doing a lot of message passing. So that's a lot of what we do with Lambda is we're passing one message to the next function. That function is doing something with it and passing it back to the next function, or it's returning back to the user. So it's definitely thinking in terms of message passing and just in general like structuring your code differently.
So how do you approach testing in a situation up into such small pieces? You verify the individual components, but then when you're bringing them together, how do you approach a solid way of testing before you send a feature live or go live?
So I mean, there's a number of ways to do it. Definitely like functional testing, unit testing. That's definitely high on the list. Integration testing is kind of difficult to do, especially when you're so ingrained into like AWS. At that point, you're basically having to stand up some environment somewhere in AWS and testing it kind of like as you would as it's running in production. So like I said, it makes local testing much more difficult and much more interesting. There are some frameworks out there at least for AWS Lambda that will like fake pass messages and things like that, so you can kind of mock out what your Lambda function might do. So it just changes the game a little bit.
Cool, thanks.
Well, good. Hey, I'm going to take just a minute to welcome anybody that might be a new viewer. This is the Rackspace Office Hours live stream. It's a little weekly show that we do every week, right here from weekly. That's how it works. We do this live from our headquarters here in San Antonio. We are live. We've Ross are joining us today. They are out in the field, and they are a couple of DevOps engineers, and we're talking about serverless architecture, specifically around AWS Lambda functions and Google's serverless functions as well. Martin and Jim, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some in the wild examples of how people are implementing this, and you had mentioned, Martin, Squirrel Bin, I think. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was actually an example from AWS about like just a case study of how you could implement something on Lambda, and it involved uploading pictures of squirrels and getting squirrels back, kind of like Paceman, one of those. But it had all kinds of components that involved image processing, storage in S3, Lambda functions. I think looks like you're sharing your screen for an example of that there.
Yeah, Tyler, if you can show that on the whole screen, that'd be great.
But this is a nice architectural example of how you might do an application with Lambda. And really the as a service components that you're thinking about in the cloud anyway, all of those come into play when you can't have say a MySQL instance on your server next to your web server, right? You
Right.
can't install that. So you really start to rely on the CDNs, on the database as a service, and files as a service with S3 or cloud files or something like that. You're really starting to rely on all of those to build a whole app. And check out that example. You could type that in Google and find Squirrelman. It's a great example of a sort of low stakes site that has a nice architecture like AWS would recommend for something that uses Lambda.
So how are you taking this information that you're receiving from our, this is something fairly new, right? And how are we taking this and synthesizing it and advising our customers, specifically our AWS customers, fanatical support for AWS customers, but also, I mean, how can we, recommend just any customer that we have? What type of things are on here that are, especially important and notice?
I mean, I would say on there, so one thing that we find a lot is there's still a lot of customers kind of moving to a cloud architecture, and so sometimes it's the serverless part is not the problem, it's just that they have this application they've already got, right? And we see that, like, any kind of shift, any kind of big paradigm shift is, I dread the day someone says, how are you going to run Oracle database on serverless architecture? And you think, oh my gosh. But there's always the question like that shows up. So, but I think for customers, the key is to have control of your app. Like if you can tie your app into S3, if you can tie your app into Lambda and break it down as a set of actions, anything really, if you can make an API for your app that you could see a client, whether it be like a single page JSON app or a mobile app, if you can kind of make an API around that, then I think you're a good fit for Lambda. So that would be like a piece of advice I would give somebody that was thinking about how they could use Lambda. Another big one is batch processing. So that's something that batch processing is a perfect example for you need to go do a little bit of work, just like Jim said, that kind of message queue, message passing architecture would be a good one.
Yeah. So whenever we have customers come through, and I've had this discussion with a few customers now, it's usually the customers are most interested, the developers are most interested in things like with the batch processing, being able to do the events once a day or once an hour, things like that. Usually the first thing they go to tackle with like a Lambda function is basically something as simple as my boss wants a report that I can generate from this database before we were running a cron on a server somewhere. Now I can do it with AWS Lambda and then kick the email over to an SNS topic. So that's usually the first place our customers look. And once they start getting more into that, then they can start seeing other places where they can split out the work. Instead of writing it into their core app, they can write it into AWS Lambda.
That's great. That's great. Those are all good ideas there around, and again, it's setting up newer things or fixing that application to make it cloud ready. I mean, I think that's something we've seen quite a bit. As Drew and I have worked on the onboarding side of things, working with our brand new cloud customers, it is something that happens where customers want to just lift up a application directly where it is and put it onto the cloud and think that they are all of a sudden cloudy and going to receive all the benefits, and it's not. We really see these benefits come in when you start to architect it correctly. I noticed that everything on that squirrel bin, anything that the end user did, any action they took, any response they received from the application, all went through that REST API, right? And so putting it all through that REST API allowed them to use the same application itself for the mobile application and any web interface. So that's the smart way that we're seeing customers be successful. Well, good. Good. Let's go ahead and Martin, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I was just going to throw in there too another case study, David Guetta. I think I had mentioned this one to you guys as well as one that was another really cool example of a site that was for a marketing campaign to check out if you're looking for. There's an interview with the folks that built it. It's another Lambda example. So
great. We'll throw that up on the
show notes.
Absolutely. Just gonna check my notes here. see what else I need to learn about. So we've been talking mostly about AWS Lambda functions, right? But also Google functions are another option, right? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
So
How they
right
differ?
now, so I haven't played with them much. It looks like they're basically the same as AWS Lambda functions in the way they kind of like work and are thought out. And they're actually still in beta, I believe. So I don't think they're actually released for for everyone. Yeah. So and right now, I think they also only support Node.js.
Ah, well, I think that's a good conversation to have. Is what languages, what actual calls can you make? So what you said Node.js for Google right now. What about Lambda functions? It seems like they've had a fairly decent amount of languages they support.
Yeah, so they'll support Java, they'll support Python, and they'll support Node.js out of the box. Beyond that, people have found ways to kind of hack in and package Ruby programs into Lambda. I've seen a lot with like Go programs because those are really easy. You just compile them into a binary. So I mean, there's ways to get around that with some of those more common languages. But right now, the three languages that they'll support is Python, Node.js, and Java.
And also,
Great.
you have to think about where they're running. So if you use some function of Linux or some function that should exist in the operating system for cryptography or something like that, you kind of need to do a little bit more thinking and testing as far as like what sort of system they're going to be run on when they do run. So you'll have to think about testing on Amazon's flavor of Linux, and they're good about it. They'll tell you exactly what image and of the you'll see when your function runs as far as your environment. So you just got to think about that a little bit. That's probably where that fuzzy line happens between Lambda and having servers.
So what are some of the ways that this is going to be changing the industry, right? So um, let's talk about, is this the silver bullet? Is this going to become what everybody is using, or is this something that is something neat to try a few different concepts on?
I mean, I really thought that it was going to blow up because I saw also Facebook getting into the game, but then I read just recently that they're discontinuing Parse, their platform for that, and
Hmm.
their platform was particularly interesting because it was focused on mobile apps. They were bypassing the idea of like a web page entirely, and it was focused on a framework for building mobile apps, but really that's just a special case of serverless architecture. So they were saying, you've got stuff like AWS Lambda that's very general, and then their version was very targeted and had additional tools specifically aimed at that market. So I think that's going to be really interesting as we see like special cases of it pop up. But I think it'll eventually occupy a large market of cloud. In fact, some people may skip going to the cloud and go right to, when they get to the cloud, just uploading chunks of code instead of server images.
So are there one or two major features that you feel like are still missing that once implemented might be the difference in it going from where it is now to just being the world beater that you hoped that it would be?
So as far as the AWS Lambda stuff, I definitely the way you configure your Lambda functions today is kind of a pain. So your options are either upload that configuration to an S3 bucket and constantly read it out every time that Lambda function invokes, or the other option is to pack that configuration file into that Lambda function. I would love to see, and if Amazon, if you're watching, I would love to see environment variables as something you can provide to your Lambda functions. You don't have to worry about config files.
All right, Martin, you have the same view, a conflicting view, an additional view?
No, I mean, I think that the other thing, I knew Jim had strong opinions on it. I would say just in addition to some of those feature things, more language support I think is always good. More language support never hurts anybody as long as it's going to be a semi-popular language, and with only Python, Java, and Node.js, I think they definitely have some opportunities. I think another language that could be done in parallel, like support for something like Go or something that had native parallelism would be like a really interesting one to introduce into a serverless environment. And other than that, just more, again, Amazon, if you're listening, more API support for some of the features that they only have through their control panel right now, like scheduling jobs to run like cron. It'd be great to do that programmatically. But that'll come, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the other questions that we typically ask when we're talking about a new technology is pairings. So where do you see Lambda specifically pairing nicely? I know we talked about Celery, we talked about Elasticsearch, so or Elastic Beanstalk. I don't know. We talked about something earlier. One of the other functions, one of the other features within Amazon. But where are some of the other pairings that really allow Lambda to shine when used in concert?
One that I can think of is that I keep seeing this term serverless startups, small startups. So it's not a technical pairing, but it's like a use case pairing. It's when you're small, everybody wants to have their startup grow and be really big. But getting, again, like you talked about at the beginning of the show, having a full staff of DBAs is not the thing you want to do at a startup. So startups, just small applications, are a huge opportunity for any kind of platform that's a service, I think. That would be one of my picks.
Jim?
I don't know. It goes with everything. Yeah.
It's like sriracha.
Yeah.
Sriracha or bacon. It goes with everything.
Yeah, exactly. Bacon sriracha or sriracha
Sold.
bacon. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sign me up for that.
It's the bacon of the cloud. I really can't pair it with anything specifically. I think it goes well with everything. I think it can do batch processing well off of databases. I mean, obviously Amazon has all their stuff working with everything else. So yeah, it works with everything.
Well, good.
Great.
So how about we ask this question then? If you were starting up a project, what specific things, if you didn't do the entire project on some type of a serverless product, whether it's Lambda Functions or Google's Functions, Azure has their web jobs, what type of things would you specifically, Jim and Martin, start with?
Batch processing, we've done a little bit of that already. I think we have some Lambda functions that go out and do reporting for our Chef servers and things like that, so we can get counts on nodes and stuff. We've implemented an API with it before, so right now the API we have is actually a fairly static API, but so it's just kind of like as you work with it more and more, and again, as you work with a lot of the AWS technology, so it's not. Lambda wouldn't be useful without like SNS or SQS. But as you work with these things more, you kind of slowly start to see the architectures form, and it's like, I want to build this project, and I want this to be this mega API that does all sorts of cool things. And then you just start thinking about, okay, I can split this out into a Lambda function, and then this out into a Lambda function, and they can talk to each other and things like that. So you just start small, start with batch processing, and then kind of move from there.
I would also put in a plug if I was looking for things to put in Lambda as nice examples, any of the services that you might already be using that support things like webhooks. Something like with Amazon's API gateway, you can get webhooks that trigger right into calls into Lambda. So if you use, maybe you've heard of these, GitHub, Slack, any of those like really popular tools that support webhooks, you could write a chat ops bot. You could make something that comments on pull requests in GitHub, something that audits data. If you have a data set and you're checking it all the time, and you don't want to run a server just to have a cron job anymore, that would be another good example. So I can see Alan looking like, what servers am I going to delete after the show?
I am. I've got a little mental checklist. I should have run a batch process to give me the most up-to-date one on that. But no, I can think of some ideas here. So this is definitely, I've learned a lot. So very
Certainly.
happy about that. Very happy. Yeah, just learned a ton. I think that this is something that a lot of our customers are going to have to start thinking about on their own, right? So as they come to the cloud, as we coach them to not just bulk forklift a application out of a bare metal server and put it into the cloud, maybe they can find ways to break that application down into smaller functions that would that would work better on these serverless functions. So a lot to think about, a lot to share with our customers.
And really, we've come a long way. So this is mentioning this again for anybody who's shown up. This is our 3-year anniversary, and we started talking about things like rack space servers.
Yeah.
As on our first show, and rack space backup, and some really
make sure you use a load balancer and
core conceptual cloud virtualization conversations. And then here we are 3 years later, and we're talking about some cutting edge stuff at Amazon that Rackspace can support and help implement. And we've got a couple of guys here who have spent time researching and tinkering and playing with and getting value from those tools, and their learning helps our customers hit their goals. So we're able to plug in the expertise that we build here at Rackspace to help customers solve problems. And in 3 years of this show, there's been massive amounts of change and massive amounts of innovation, and customers still have similar problems to solve. There are just more ways to solve them, and as that grows, and as your ability to keep up with all of the potential ways to skin the same cat is more difficult to keep up with that, we have people who are keeping up on all of the different frontiers, and we can bring that expertise to bear to solve your customer problems. So as your business runs into, we need to be able to do X, Y, and Z with these constraints, let us in on those conversations, because it may be a situation where we can set you up with a solution that doesn't actually involve servers. That'd be fantastic. There'd be a lot less for you to worry about. It would help us implement a solution that is less for us to maintain as well, so everyone wins. But that architecture of building a solution that meets your needs is always top of mind, whatever that architecture ends up being. If it's all bare metal, if it's serverless, if it's anywhere in between, it's Rackers bringing their expertise to bear on solving customer problems, whatever unique issues you have, whatever specific constraints are inherent. We're working to find ways to solve those problems and solve them better and solve them in your specific scenario. So without a conversation, it's going to be hard for us to do so. But when you engage your Rackspace support team, you're going to be able to have those conversations and pull in those resources. And that's the one thing that I'm the most excited about working for Rackspace, is I get access to all sorts of bright people who can solve all sorts of difficult problems with a very broad tool set. And so thank you guys for joining us today and sharing what's on the frontier of solving problems, of solving all sorts of IT needs, not every single one. We've talked about that today. But it's a lot of fun, and we've come a long way.
Couldn't have said it better. Couldn't have said it better. So yeah, thank you, Martin and Jim, for spending a little bit of time with us. We've always said that we wanted to have people on the show that can help us to understand these concepts better and to explain them for us and to help us explain those to our customers as well. Mm-hmm. So thank you guys. Really appreciate you both taking a little bit of time out to join us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, certainly. I think that I love, like you said, Drew, I love as the tool belt grows, being able to suggest the right tool for each problem with customers, and this is sort of a similar conversation to tell them about it at large. So it's one of the things I love about being at Rackspace too, is that we get to solve the problem with the right tool. It's amazing to be around so many people that have all of this knowledge and can solve those the right way.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me. It's been very fun, and yeah, as we get to see all sorts of very interesting architectures. So I mean, things that you wouldn't even think about. So it's very interesting to try and solve these problems for our customers.
Yeah, I love learning more about the out-of-the-box ways people are solving a specific issue. I didn't even mean to make a pun there, but I'm gonna go back and mark that one as mine. I did it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an accident, but it happened. finding all of these unique solutions, and when a customer comes to us with a unique approach, that kind of a concept then goes into our backlog and our lessons learned, work or not, and that just builds our ability to expertly consult with the next customer that comes in. So it is really thrilling to see somebody come on with this beautiful approach that isn't something we'd thought of but works great, because that means we're getting better at our jobs, and it's painful when it's the opposite, but that still goes into the backlog, and we still can say, we've seen that tried, we've helped attempt to make that work, and that doesn't work. So avoid that. Don't trip over that same problem. Go this other way. We've seen better results with it. So it is a lot of fun to see those unique architectures, unique approaches, and excellent solutions.
All right. Well, Martin and Jim, do you have anything else that we absolutely need to know about serverless architecture before we wrap it up?
I would just put in a plug. It looks like there's a conference, there's a community forming around this, and it looks like there's going to be a first conference they're going to try to host in May. That looks really interesting to me. If I can figure out a way to get there, I will check that out. And then also, there's a serverless blog that has a lot of those case studies and things we've talked about. Check that out. There's lots of resources out there, so check those two out. Those look really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I would just say, whenever you do your next project, remember serverless architectures, and definitely remember the costs associated with it, because even when you have auto scale and things like that with servers, you still have servers that are potentially sitting idle, versus Lambda functions where they only trigger when someone hits it.
That's a good point.
Efficiency.
And Jim's humble, but he's got a really cool open source project out there. I'll put a plug-in for called Lambda Uploader. He's written some tools around how to make it easier to use Lambda at AWS. So check out his project. It's pretty cool.
Good stuff. Thanks for humbling Jim there. I appreciate that. Well, cool. Oh, one other thing that I'll plug real quick. You mentioned earlier that that Parse is shutting down, and Object Rocket has built a it's our MongoDB and other NoSQL databases as a service. They've actually built some connectors to actually ingest that and migrate, make it more efficient. So that is, if you're looking to migrate your Parse database to Mongo or something like that, you can pretty easily do that with Object Rocket. So check that out if you're in that boat. All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. This is what, episode 139, year 3.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, we're finishing it up. Yeah, we'll end it up here with some sweet sriracha uncured bacon jerky from Trader Joe's. So that's absolutely. I think that's what I'm going to have to go out and get here in a minute, because that looks awesome. So that'll be our mascot for this episode. Number 139. We've got all of our episodes available at Rackspace's YouTube channel, and we also have several different episodes that are available on audio-only podcast over at ohpodcast.com.
Mm-hmm.
You can subscribe to the RSS feed and listen to that if you are driving around in the car and want to learn more about serverless architecture and everything else. It's a great way to do it. And we'll be back next week with another episode, and I guess on that note, we'll say see you next week.